Once upon a time, Spellbreak was labeled as the Fortnite Killer, and it was the most anticipated Battle Royale of 2020, gathering 5 million players in just under 3 weeks of release and an insane amount of hype for the spellcasting combat system in a market where every other game was just centered around guns instead. So it was safe to say that the expectations that were set for Spellbreak were incredibly high with how promising and innovative the title was looking. However, because of some major issues that the game would face, the title of Fortnite Killer might have been a little too much for the Proletariat team to live up to. And I got the chance to play Spellbreak during closed alpha all the way back in 2019, and this is one of my favorite Battle Royale games, so it's always sad to see when your favorite game just gets shut down, but you know, you'll be surprised to see what the community's been doing with the game ever since. Now, Spellbreak was made by a small team of just 6 people at Proletariat who wanted to make a fantasy-themed Battle Royale to follow the rising trend of VR games popping up left and right, and originally they were aiming to go for using swords instead of sorcery, but you know, eventually they settled on the spellcasting gameplay that was actually inspired by games like Unreal Tournament and Quake. The spells that you were able to cast were based off what elemental gauntlets you were wearing, and the game was already a visual masterpiece. You looked at it and it was like aesthetically beautiful, which was one of the main selling points of Spellbreak, but what really sold the game was just how visually striking the magic battles looked and how dynamic the spellcasting was, since you were able to use multiple elements to throw out different combination attacks, and you could kind of just experiment to see how the different elements combined with each other. A lot of people were comparing the aesthetics of Spellbreak to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, but even though the game at the beginning had an explosive reception and it was bringing in a completely new dynamic and innovative side to the Battle Royale genre, well, Spellbreak still had to go through a couple of obstacles to try to carve out a name for itself, because aesthetics and fun gameplay will only get you so far in the modern gaming world. Which, by the way, isn't it weird to say that fun gameplay just isn't enough anymore? If you want your game to succeed, especially if it's a live service game, you can't just have fun, you have to have something else. You have to have battle passes, microtransactions, daily login quests, you know, all that stuff that gamers hate about live service gaming. Unfortunately, that's also the recipe for success in here. Now your game needs to have fun gameplay, but it also needs to have psychological addictive elements to it as well. So the challenges that Spellbreak had to face were not to just attract players into the game, but also keep up with updates and gameplay features to keep people interested over time. So that's where some of the first issues with Spellbreak would start to show up, because when we talk about Spellbreak gameplay, we talk about how the different spells were visually awesome to look at and the gauntlet combinations gave you a few different playstyles to explore, but when it came down to the actual combat mechanics of how fights happen inside the game, honestly, things would get so chaotic that sometimes all you would see is just a bunch of spells being hurled around in the map without any rhyme or reason, which probably wasn't the case at the more higher levels of competitive play, but because the game had a pretty steep learning curve, then the casual player, you know, their typical experience was usually just boiled down to just spamming spells nonstop, which made the game seem like it had no depth or strategy to its combat system. And because Spellbreak only had 6 different types of gauntlets, and throughout its entire lifespan, the team at Proletariat never brought any new weapons or gauntlets into the game, then the players were often complaining that there was a lack of fresh updates to the game, since the gameplay felt repetitive by just casting the same 6 spells over and over again. And that's not to say that the game didn't get any updates at all, because when you look at some of the items on the battle pass, you know, some of the skins that were introduced, you look at them and you're like, wow, there's a lot of detail that went into this, man. And of course you had different game modes, and some of the minor changes on the map happened here and there, but you have to remember that this was a small development team, so the updates that were coming in were usually slow, and you know, nothing really groundbreaking enough for people to get super excited about. So unfortunately, every time you logged into Spellbreak, no matter how much time had passed in between, Spellbreak kinda always just felt the same. And as a result of this, the player base in Spellbreak started to decline, you know, as many live service games do after their initial spike, but what Proletariat did as a response to their game lobbies emptying up actually ended up making things worse. After the game's initial hype died down, Spellbreak started struggling to get full 42-player lobbies, which is already less than half of what the typical Fortnite lobby is, but as a response to this, Proletariat first tried sneaking bots into the lobbies to fill them up, just hoping nobody would notice and make the game seem more alive than what it really was. But the problem here is that unless you're literally a 3-year-old, you know, you can tell when you're fighting a bot right away, and if you're new to the game, then it's okay to have some here and there to sort of like ease you into how the game works, but in this case it was actually rare when you didn't get bots in your lobbies regardless of playtime. And that just takes all the fun out of playing player versus player games, because you always have that question in the back of your mind going like, was that guy a bot? Was he not a bot? He just died too easily? I don't know, man. And to make matters worse, on top of having bots in your games, Spellbreak didn't have the option to select which region you wanted to play in, which would force people to play on servers that had extremely high ping and make the game borderline unplayable in most cases. So the game had forced auto region, which honestly normally would never be a problem if, if the game was full, if the player base was healthy, because the servers are full, the lobbies are full, and everyone's happy. But as the game started to die down and the queue times were taking longer, the players started getting funneled into servers from the other side of the world. And I got to experience this a couple of times myself where, attacks were just not registering, there was a bunch of like glitchy movement and rubber banding, and eventually I would just get disconnected from the game entirely. So having a game with forced auto regen and no option to turn it off is a pretty surefire way to kill your own game, because the players just will not want to dealing with high ping inside video games. But if you really want to go for the overkill here on how to ruin your game's player base, then you gotta take a page of what Spellbreak did here, because when you're trying to get new players into your game, it's important to give them a steady, reliable feeling of what to expect, which usually means you have a core game mode that you want to push, and not just branching out into different directions. Like, do you guys remember when Apex Legends first launched, where you had trios and you just had trios? And when you think about Apex Legends as a game, you consider it a trio-focused battle royale. Like, it wasn't until way later that the game reached a stable position that they started to experiment with like arenas and duos and such. So the main problem here is that Spellbreak really didn't have that level of steady focus, and they made the mistake of releasing too many game modes rotating between them too fast. And they were probably just trying to address what the community was asking for, but in that process of listening to all the different opinions from the different players, they kind of just lost focus on determining what they wanted Spellbreak to be, and just ended up fragmenting the player base even more into half-empty lobbies that were riddled with bots, and were filled with players from across the globe that had ridiculously high ping. So unfortunately, after having so many things go wrong in so many different ways, well, after a long and hard battle, Proletariat announced that the Fortnite Killer Spellbreak was bound to shut down in 2022. The studio had been acquired by Blizzard Entertainment to go work on World of Warcraft instead, effectively marking the end of Spellbreak's development, but the developers still had one more trick up their sleeve before they left to kind of just make peace with the Spellbreak community. You see, Proletariat, what they did is that they uploaded Spellbreak to the itch.io website, which is a website where indie developers just upload games for people to try and play and, just test out. So what that meant is that anybody could go into the itch.io website and download the files for the game to play whenever they wanted, even after the game servers had shut down officially. So you could just download the game onto your own computer if you wanted to, you can go play against bots, and even host your own lobbies to play with your friends. So while Proletariat itself might be done with Spellbreak, the community is still out there enjoying the game and trying to keep it alive. Like, one of the biggest communities out there at the moment is called Elemental Fracture on Discord, that has over 4,000 members and does community events every now and then, and they even managed to throw out a balance patch for the game, so there's people that are actively working on the game too. But unfortunately, when it comes to the official side of Spellbreak, they never really got the chance to sustain that viral level of success over the long run. A lot of people think that the reason the game failed is because they tried to jump on the Battle Royale trend instead of trying to make something more unique, and I have to say I kind of agree with this too, because Spellbreak had the aesthetics, it had the gameplay, it had everything going for it to be a successful adventure game, I don't know, RPG game, single player game, survival game. Like, if the game was literally anything except a live service game, I'm pretty sure it could have popped off. I'm pretty sure it could have done a lot of things, but I guess we'll never know, right? I guess we will never know. But yeah, that's all I really want to talk about with you guys today, so thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.